So hello, my name is Matt Bowker and I manage Rhodes Scholars virtual lecture series, and it's my pleasure to host today's virtual lecture. So these lectures are free and available to Rhodes Scholar participants as well as anyone who loves to learn. So spread the word. This virtual program is critical to helping us pursue our not-for-profit mission of making learning accessible to as many lifelong learners as we can, even those who do not have the physical ability or financial means to travel, or leave their homes to join us on a program. Ultimately, this series would not be possible without the support of participants just like you who have funded this project through generous donations. So please consider making a donation to Not-for-Profit Rhodes Scholar so that we can continue to provide educational experiences both in the virtual classroom and beyond. So please visit rhodescholar.org/give to show your support with a monetary donation. Every dollar helps. So Rhodes Scholar is headquartered in Boston, but we have offices and staff around the world. And today you'll be hearing from Dr. Spencer Jones. Spencer is a senior lecturer in armed forces and war studies at the University of Wolverhampton and is the author of several books on the Boer War and World War I. So before we begin, a few quick notes. Spencer will present for approximately 30 minutes, after which we will host a 10 to 15 minute question and answer session. Now, during this session, you can submit questions using the question and answer icon located at the bottom of your screen. And then afterwards, I will read a few questions live for Spencer to respond. Now, should technical issues force you to miss any portion of this webinar, don't worry. We'll be adding recording of the lecture to our online virtual lecture library. And finally, at the end of the Q&A, you'll be prompted to take a very short survey. And just like on any Scholar program, you take a few moments to fill it out. It will help us grow and improve our virtual lecture series. So let's have a warm virtual welcome for Dr. Spencer Jones.
Thank you very much, Matt, and thank you, the audience, for tuning in today. This is actually my fifth lecture now for Rhodes Scholar. If you've seen me before, welcome back. If this is your first time, welcome indeed. And the subject that you're tuning into today is one that I actually offered as a possible talk for Rhodes Scholar, because it's a source, I think, of enduring interest. And it's one of those relatively rare historical questions, the causes of the First World War, that still, a century after this war broke out, does not have a definitive answer. Thousands, if not millions of words have been written on the causes of the First World War. Careers in academia and elsewhere have risen and fallen on attempting to explain why Europe and eventually the world tore itself apart between 1914 and 1918. And this debate, you might think, would have been settled after a century, but I assure you it is absolutely still one of the most vociferous debates amongst historians of the First World War. What I'm going to present to you in the next 30 minutes, therefore, is not the definitive answer to this question. Rather, it's my interpretation of the causes of the First World War. It's based on my own reading and my own research, but it is not the only interpretation. I actually think that's a source of strength. It's one of the great sources of interest. There are many ways to interpret these events. Perhaps you'll agree with me at the end of this lecture, or perhaps you'll have further questions, which of course I will be happy to try and answer. But above all else, I hope it provides much food for thought. To begin our discussion of the causes of the First World War, we actually have to step back some 40 years before the war broke out and look at the end of Europe, or at least Western Europe's last great war. This was the Franco-Prussian War between France and a united, or at least semi-united, Germany under the leadership of Prussia, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71. It was a complete defeat for France. Imperial France under Napoleon III was crushed. Utterly crushed. Republican France fought on, but could not hold off the Germans. Paris fell after a siege, and then, as the ultimate insult, Germany crowned its very first emperor in the famous Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, of course, the home of the Bourbon monarchy before the Revolution. An act designed to both spite, humiliate France, and also promote the sheer power of Germany. But this was not all. Also, at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, Germany made a fateful decision. As well as imposing a great war indemnity on France, designed at least with some strategic purpose to keep France weak to prevent any war of revenge, Germany made a decision to annex part of French territory. This was this area, Alsace-Lorraine, two French provinces, that bordered Germany. The official reason for taking these provinces was to provide a buffer zone to prevent France from easily invading Germany in the future. Any invasion of Germany from this point would have to either pass through a neutral country, Belgium most likely, or would pass through these occupied provinces, which of course were largely populated with the French. This decision to deprive France of this territory was a severe blow, more severe than the war indemnity. The war indemnity was paid off with relative ease, but the loss of these provinces, which had been part of France for centuries and were still populated, of course, with French speakers who now came under German rule, was a grave and bitter blow. It was actually a blow that the German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, of course, famous as the Iron Chancellor, the man who perhaps more than any other did the most to unite Germany, would come to regret, because it created a problem for Germany. Far from creating a buffer state that would actually weaken France, it gave a long-lasting source of bitterness for the French that would fester and rankle for decades, and it would lead directly to the creation of a dangerous balance of power, which I will explore in just a few slides' time. The bitterness about the loss of Alsace-Lorraine lasted far beyond the end of the war. A famous painting here from 1887, La Tache Noire, the black spot. And in this picture, it's also known as the geography class, you can see a geography master teaching the boys about these lost provinces. And if you can just see on the the map, he's pointing at, you can see that the area of Alsace-Lorraine is shaded black, the so-called lost provinces. And certainly for decades after the end of the war, the French school children, French people were told about the disgrace of this, the loss of French speakers who were effectively under enemy occupation. And there was much desire to try and reclaim this lost land. Of course, diplomatic ways to reclaim it were impossible. War was likely to be the only outcome of it. And so this laid the seeds for resentment and hatred, perhaps, if we may go that far, between France and Germany, which would be the root cause, if not the only cause, of the tensions that would eventually engulf Europe in the early part of the 20th century. What this led to was the creation of a balance of power. And what I've presented to you here is a map showing Europe and the European alliances, or at least agreements, that defined the balance of power in 1914. In grey, we have the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia. And in red, we have the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Italy. Now, the balance of power is a peculiar thing. In many ways, it was actually created by Germany in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War. It became very apparent to Germany relatively soon that France had recovered from the war much faster than anticipated. The war indemnity was paid off, the French military reorganized itself, the French economy boomed in the 1880s and 1890s, and a revitalized France was keen for revanchism, revenge upon the Germans for this humiliating defeat in the 1870s. To prevent this happening, German diplomacy concentrated on creating an alliance bloc that kept France isolated. And indeed, for some years, this worked. But it led to a shifting mosaic of alliances. And certainly by the turn of the century, 1900, Germany's attempts to try and keep France isolated had largely failed. France had agreed an alliance with Russia in the east, and by 1904 had agreed not an alliance, but an understanding with Britain, the so-called Entente Cordiale, the friendly understanding. Germany sought allies of its own, allying with Austro-Hungary, with whom it shared both linguistic origins and also, of course, a common border, and also with Italy, a relatively newcomer to the European scene, but a country that owed something to German aid in the 1870s, and so was part of that alliance system. The balance of power linked these countries together. It's often seen as a problem in the outbreak of the First World War, because by linking countries together, countries became locked into conflicts that perhaps did not concern them, because there was, if one member of the alliance was to be attacked or humiliated or troubled, then the other members would come to them. But in fact, the balance of power was relatively successful in maintaining European peace between 1900 and 1914. The powers were indeed relatively balanced, and although that balance may tilt occasionally in the favor of one group or the other, largely the balance was sufficient to prevent either of the group believing they could win a war against the other. It's also worth noting that the balance of power was essentially defensive. Agreements, particularly between France, Britain, and Russia, were all defensive. The idea being that if Germany, or indeed anybody else, attacked one of these countries, the other powers would come to their aid. They were not really designed to take offensive war. I should also add that the Triple Alliance was also a defensive alliance designed to protect Germany and Austro-Hungary against either French or Russian aggression. So these alliances were defensive. They were not actually designed about expanding one's nation's power, but rather preserving it. And within the context of 1900 to 1914, the balance of power actually achieved its aims. There were various crises, diplomatic crises, problems, confrontations between 1900 and 1914. But what's striking is that all of them were resolved diplomatically until we reached that fateful year of 1914. And the balance of power, although it was in many ways dangerous, as I'll explain in a moment, it did nevertheless play a role in preserving peace. So why was it dangerous? It was because, like all balances of power, it was also simultaneously a balance of fear. This map here, it's from a German source. This type of map conveys something of the feeling within Europe on the eve of the war. And in this map, this type of map was very, very popular across Europe at the time to portray nations as animals or in a cartoon form to get across a message. And here we see the heroic soldiers of Germany and Austro-Hungary, and they're surrounded by enemies. You have the Russian giant here, a hideous, ugly giant, determined to consume Germany and Austro-Hungary. You have France, rather ridiculous here, being kicked by the Germans. You have rather fatuous and ridiculous Italy. Britain portrayed here as a Scotsman just gazing on while seated on a battleship. And down here you have Serbia, who we'll hear more about later, portrayed as a pig ripe for the slaughter at the hands of Austro-Hungary. This map does convey a certain message. The balance of power existed because the two power groups feared one another. Neither of them thought they could win a war against the other, or at least they could not win a war without tremendous cost. But equally, that climate of fear contributed to certain problems. All the combatant nations spent enormous amounts of money on their military. All nations feared being hit by what we would now perhaps term a first strike, a sudden invasion which their own army could not react to in time, or which their own army was perhaps too small to deal with. And this meant that military spending across the continent between 1900 and 1914 simply grew and grew. And as one nation would spend more on its military, its rivals would have to match that spending in an ever-increasing spiral which effectively had no end. Certainly by 1913 and 1914, France had reached a point where it simply didn't believe it could spend any more on its military to try and keep track with Germany. But equally, Germany was terrified of Russia and Russia's military reforms, which threatened to create a truly formidable Russian army by 1917. And so all countries were fearful of the growing power of one another. And as the great English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, and his famous work Leviathan on the Nature of Government, published in the 1600s, commented that fear is the root cause of all conflict. And fear certainly existed in the minds of the diplomats within Europe in 1900 to 1914. And that fear, despite the fact that these confrontations were solved peacefully up to this point, this fear was growing by 1914 as armies became ever larger and the risks of military conflict for which a nation was unprepared for became ever greater. In this climate of fear, we can add something of a rogue element. And this is this man, Kaiser Wilhelm II, the third emperor of Germany. The man I showed you being crowned in 1871 was his grandfather. Kaiser Wilhelm ascended to the throne in 1888, the year of the so-called year of the three emperors. His grandfather passed away, and then his own father, suffering from cancer, died 3 months later. Wilhelm was thus catapulted into the position of emperor before he was effectively ready. And Wilhelm, to his contemporaries and to subsequent historians, is something of a maddening character. He was a man with undoubted certain element of brilliance. He was quick-witted, he was a lover of the sciences, he endorsed modernity, he had at times great energy, and at times insight as well. But he was also vain, narcissistic, troubled, impulsive, a man who tended to shoot from the hip, a man who was all too keen to rattle sabers, but then flee at the first sign of conflict, a man who found details, facts, and hard work rather too much to deal with. And as Otto von Bismarck commented in a brilliant summary of Kaiser Wilhelm II's attitude, he wished that every day would be his birthday. He needed constant praise. He became enraged at any minor slights and reacted poorly to them. He was also a deeply troubled man, perhaps psychologically troubled. He'd been born in a breech birth. He'd had a very, very difficult birth, which had left him with a crippled left arm, which by the time he was an adult was 6 inches shorter than his right arm. This troubled him for his entire life. And as a result, he had a very difficult relationship with his English mother, Victoria, one of the daughters of Queen Victoria. And this may explain his intense Anglophobia, which manifested throughout his reign. Why is the Kaiser so dangerous within this context? It's because Germany, despite having in some ways stronger democratic institutions than contemporary Britain at this time, Germany was dominated by a relatively narrow decision-making group with the Kaiser at their head. It's remarkable indeed the extent to which European politics in this period, or international politics, is dominated by small groups. And within Kaiser's Germany, he was a very important figure. Very little could be done without his say-so. But because of his erratic personality, he was simultaneously easy to manipulate by those who wished to do so, and equally a man who caused chaos wherever he went. His bellicose attitude was a hazard both domestically and internationally. And as we shall see, this contributes greatly to the growing atmosphere of fear in the run-up to 1914. As an example of the Kaiser's ability to spread fear and spread discord, we can look at the Anglo-German naval race, which really began just before 1900, but accelerated after 1900 up to 1914. There's a cartoon, there's a British cartoon here showing the Kaiser and John Bull. John Bull, of course, is the embodiment of Britain, rather like Uncle Sam might be the embodiment of the USA, playing poker with battleships. Germany's decision to build a vast and powerful fleet was aimed at intimidating Britain and causing Britain to keep out of international, or at least European affairs. But there was no way, despite the best efforts of Germany, that could ever match the British fleet in terms of production or in terms of number of ships it could keep afloat, or indeed, especially across global sea lanes. And the Anglo-German naval race became almost futile, and yet it was a naval race that the Kaiser greatly approved of, encouraged, and drove forward, of course manipulated to no small extent by his admirals, who were all too keen to play on his vanity and insist to him that the only way Germany could become a true world power was to generate a mighty fleet. All the German naval fleet actually did, in diplomatic terms, was alienate the British and push the British closer to the French and by extension to the Russians as part of the Triple Entente. It was a diplomatic folly, and indeed in many ways it was a military folly, because the resources devoted into the German fleet could have been much better spent elsewhere. And despite British efforts at various times to get out of this naval race, to encourage a moratorium on the building of new ships, Germany repeatedly refused and simply increased the tensions as the years went by for no great strategic or diplomatic advantage. It was a foolish policy, one promoted not merely by the Kaiser, but certainly approved of by him, and encapsulates, I think, some of the erratic nature of Kaiser Wilhelm II and indeed his closest advisors. But perhaps the most important example of the Kaiser's erratic nature, and by extension his cabinet's erratic nature, was the 1912 crisis in Morocco. And we have a picture here of the Kaiser reaching out from the sea, a rather ridiculous looking Kaiser, and squashing Agadir in Morocco beneath his gloved fist, his mailed fist. This was actually the second time Germany had intervened in Morocco, the North African country. France had interests there and indeed had the dominant influence of the colonial powers there. But Germany, not only in 1912, but also earlier in 1906, had attempted to exert influence here. There was no great strategic advantage to be gained from this for Germany, and certainly no great economic advantage. Morocco was not a wealthy country and had little in the way of markets to invest in. But the Kaiser's decision to return to Morocco in 1912 and indeed attempt to provoke a problem with the French encapsulates some of the erratic thinking that underpinned much German foreign policy in this period. And it also led to a sensational event, and one which historians have often seen as the first sighting of the outbreak of the European War. And this came in December 1912 on a Sunday at the height of this so-called Moroccan crisis, where it really did look as though war might break out between France and Germany. Germany provoking the French by clearly interfering within their colonial empire, pressuring the Triple Entente to react, threatening all kinds of wars and terrible things. And in December 1912, the Kaiser sat down with many of his closest military advisors, and they held what has been subsequently described as a war council, in which they discussed the possibility of starting a war there and then in December 1912. Certainly, there were those within the army who believed this was the right move. They pointed to the fact that Russia was growing stronger by the day and that indeed Russian rearmament was proceeding at a faster pace than expected. They also pointed to the fact that the French were increasing their military spending. And a number of military personnel felt that 1912 was the ideal time to start the war. In fact, the failure to start a war in 1912 owed something to the German Navy. The German Navy was constructing the so-called Kiel Canal, which would allow its fleet to transfer from the Baltic Sea into the North Sea, and asked for a year and a half to complete this work, at which point the Navy would be ready to fight a war alongside the army. There's also some suggestion that Kaiser himself, remember he was an erratic man, he was keen to rattle sabres, rather not so keen to follow through, may have lost his nerve. Indeed, Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg later described that the Kaiser toppled over at the thought of actually carrying out a war, despite his warlike rhetoric in December 1912. But what's interesting is that at this stage, the Germans were now seriously considering launching an offensive war into Europe as a way to solve what they perceived as their international relations problems. Move on. Helmuth von Moltke, who of course was at this council, the supreme commander of the German army, concluded at the end of it that war is unavoidable. The sooner, the better. And historians have seen this, in my opinion, correctly, as the beginnings of a serious effort from the Germans to look for an opportunity to begin a war, to knock out their European rivals, and to become the dominant power on the continent, to upset the balance of power in that respect. And it was in the East where they were to find an opportunity to do this, because in the East of Europe, we have a mixture of decaying empires and upstart, newly formed states. And this all centers around this region here, the Balkans. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire here, modern-day Turkey, had ruled the Balkans under a relatively brutal occupation. But that occupation had gradually been broken through the 19th century, and certainly by the start of the 20th century, the Balkans had largely freed itself from Ottoman rule. But these states in the Balkans were relatively small states. They were unpredictable. They were relatively autocratic. They didn't really have democratic institutions. And they found themselves between three relatively weak empires. The Ottoman Empire, decaying, the so-called sick man of Europe. The Russian Empire seemed to be tottering after its defeat at the hands of Japan in 1905 and its internal unrest. And above all else, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, pictured here, a successor of the Holy Roman Empire, which dated from centuries earlier in Europe. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had endured its own trials and tribulations in the 19th century. It was a vast empire, Central European landmass, with no less than 11 different official languages, many different ethnic groups, but dominated by the Austrians and the Hungarians in what was known as the Dual Monarchy. Austro-Hungary was a declining empire. The pressures within it were causing friction and problems. The linguistic barriers and indeed racial intolerances in certain parts of Austro-Hungary were threatening uprisings. And above all else, they had a problem to the south, and this was the nation here, Serbia, a relatively newcomer on the European scene, which was, of course, a Slavic nation and promoted the idea of pan-Slavism, that is to say, a union of all Slavic races, which, of course, included part of Russia and also part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was not prepared to surrender its preeminent position without a fight. It despised Serbia, it despised the pan-Slavism that was being spread into Austro-Hungary, and not unreasonably, it also suspected that Serbia was sponsoring terrorism at the edges of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We know now that this was correct, and in fact, the Serbians were sponsoring and arming terrorists to try and destabilize the empire. But Austro-Hungary, racked with internal problems, saw external expansion as the way out of its difficulties, and it was gradually munching its way south. It had annexed Bosnia here in 1908, and it aspired to annex Serbia. It thought if it brought Serbia under within the empire, then it would be able to police it properly, it would be able to effectively crush it. And Austro-Hungary believed that the solution to internal problems was southward expansion and to expand itself into these new, relatively weak states and continue to add their economic wealth to it. In this, of course, they were opposed by Russia, the self-appointed protector of Slavs in this region, and also an ally, of course, to Serbia. These decaying empires who were determined to maintain their influence would, of course, become the ones who would embroil Europe into a wider conflict. But remember, of course, that Germany and Austro-Hungary are allied. This will become important in just a moment. The tensions here were bubbling away throughout the 1900s, and they came close to bursting in 1912, 1913. Wars were fought in the Balkan regions between alliances, the Balkan states, against the Ottoman Empire, and indeed against one another as they fought for the spoils of the earlier war. Wonderful British picture here from 1913, known as Boiling Point, and you have representatives of all the great powers trying to keep the lid on a bubbling cauldron that's known as Balkan Troubles. The potential danger in the Balkans of creating a flashpoint between these decaying empires was thus widely recognized, and indeed it was hoped that through clever diplomacy any kind of crisis such as this would be avoided, but it was well recognized this was a danger. And that danger went from being merely potential to being actual on the 28th of June 1914, when a young 19-year-old Serbian assassin, Gavrilo Princip, murdered Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Sophie, his wife, in Sarajevo. Franz Ferdinand actually married for love, quite unusually within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he'd renounced his right to actually succeed to the throne. So although he was technically the heir, he was not actually about to receive the throne. Nevertheless, the murder of a major Austrian member of the Austrian royal family was an intolerable insult to Austro-Hungary. And on top of the other provocations that Serbia seemed to have delivered towards Austro-Hungary, not to mention the suspicion it was exporting terrorism, this seemed like a grave insult, because indeed it was. What's interesting about this, though, is that European powers, although alarmed by this assassination in June and July 1914, the general feeling was that Austria would demand concessions from Serbia and would receive them, that there would be a diplomatic compromise. Diplomats in the West and indeed in Russia were not overly concerned at this event, and that may surprise you, but if you bear in mind that assassinations of members of the royal family, or indeed attempted assassinations of members of the royal family across Europe, were actually quite a common occurrence in the early 1900s. The Serbian king and his wife had been savagely murdered by their own military in 1903, for example, then this becomes more explicable. Anarchism, terrorism, and murder of prominent royals was not entirely unknown in Europe, and although this was a shocking murder, given the context, it was not considered in itself a pretext for war. What was going to make it a pretext for war was the interaction between Germany and Austro-Hungary. And here we have a picture of Wilhelm II and the Emperor of Austro-Hungary, Franz Joseph I. Wilhelm was infuriated. In the way that he often was, he reacted quickly, and he wrote indeed to Franz Joseph I, insisting that the Serbs must be disposed of, and right soon. And this, of course, coincided with much Austro-Hungarian thinking. They'd long desired an excuse to crush Serbia, this impudent little state to their south, who they felt was a source of constant trouble. What had prevented them from acting against Serbia in the past was a lack of pretext for war and the threat of Russia, who, of course, were the self-appointed protectors of Serbia. But the insistence of Germany, and indeed the support of Germany, changed the nature of this encounter. As an Austrian diplomat reported back to Franz Joseph I, whatever way we decide, we may always be certain that we will find Germany at our side. And this is something that's known to historians as the so-called blank check. An agreement, an unlimited agreement that was provided by Germany to Austro-Hungary in the knowledge that if Austro-Hungary declared war, Germany would still support them in this war, even if this resulted in a wider European conflict. And for many years, historians found this inexplicable. Why would Germany suddenly guarantee Austro-Hungary such as this, even the high likelihood this would provoke a European war? Why risk everything over what was essentially a localized matter in the Balkans? But of course, when you consider the December War Council, which had seriously speculated on starting a war there and then, but had decided to delay it, or at least the Navy wanted to delay it for a year and a half, suddenly it becomes rather more explicable. If Germany had been planning, or at least considering a war for this long, this was finally the pretext it had wanted for a long time. And so a deadly spiral followed. On the 28th of June, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie took place. On the 5th of July, Germany offers unconditional support to Austro-Hungary, the so-called blank check. On the 23rd of July, the Austro-Hungarians provide an ultimatum to Serbia. This ultimatum was unacceptable. It effectively asked the Serbs to surrender their judiciary independence, allow Austro-Hungarian officials to operate with impunity on Serbian soil, and other such problems. And though Serbia was willing to negotiate on these points, Austro-Hungary was not interested in negotiation. Indeed, the memorandum was created with the intention that Serbia would reject it, which would provide the much desired pretext for war. And indeed, 5 days after that ultimatum, Austria declared war on Serbia. Russia, the protector of Serbia, at this stage mobilized. It did not declare war, but it mobilized. And this was the trigger event that Germany had been waiting for. Simply the threat of Russian mobilization was seen to present such a clear and present danger to Germany that it would allow Germany to trigger its own war plans. And so on the 1st of August, Germany declared war on Russia. And then on the 4th of August, Germany began its invasion of Western Europe to crush Russia's ally, France. In doing so, it invaded Belgium, neutral, completely neutral country, and therefore, according to the rules of European war, not eligible to be involved in one. It was invaded nevertheless, which prompted Britain, who guaranteed Belgian independence through an 1839 treaty, to warn Germany not to become involved. Germany ignored this warning, and Britain declared war. And then with the final act on the 6th of August of Austria declaring war on Russia, the central powers of Austria and Austro-Hungary and Germany, and the triple entente of Britain, France, and Russia were suddenly emblazoned in a terrible war. To give you an idea about the nature of the Kaiser's personality, at the 11th hour, between the 30th of July and the 1st of August, he again had a wobble. The Germans only had one clear war plan, and that was the so-called Schlieffen Plan, which was to invade France and crush it within 6 weeks before turning all forces to the east and crushing Russia in return. And so if you've ever wondered why the mobilization of Russia suddenly prompts Germany to invade France, it is the nature of German war planning, that they felt they could not fight a two-front war. They wished to crush France first and then turn to Russia. But even at this 11th hour, as the war is clearly about to be declared, the Kaiser has a wobble. Remember, he toppled over in 1912. He wobbles again, and he actually asks his generals if it's possible to change the war plan, and rather than going to war with France, and by extension Britain, instead, is it possible to invade Russia alone? And an exasperated Helmut von Moltke tells him this is impossible, that Germany is now committed to this course. It is committed to a general European war. Without Germany's support, however, it is vanishingly unlikely Austro-Hungary would have threatened Serbia with war. The risk of embroiling the Russians, who are a strong and powerful empire relative to the Austro-Hungarians, was too great. And it was only that promise of unconditional support that would encourage the Austro-Hungarians to take this huge gamble with the future of their empire. And it is awfully tempting to believe that that war planning, that war council in December 1912 now came to fruition in the summer of 1914, as at last a clear pretext for war had been created. And that pretext was that Germany was under threat, that the Russian mobilization was clearly aimed to invade German territory, and that the only way to prevent this was to immediately fight a wide, expansive war. And indeed, this mood is captured by this man, Admiral George von Muller, an attendee at both the 1912 War Council and in 1914. And he wrote in his diary on the 1st of August, "The mood is brilliant. The government has succeeded very well in making us appear as the attacked." This, of course, is a reference to the fact that the German declaration of war was in response to the Russian mobilization, and therefore the Germans were able to claim, spuriously in my opinion, that they were acting in a defensive arrangement. But Muller's diary entry here gives the truth to that lie, that in fact the German government was manipulating the situation to make it appear as if they were attacked, to therefore justify their own warlike policy. And one of the tragedies of Germany going to war at this stage is the final decision to go to war. The Kaiser consulted just 12 people. Presiding over a country of many millions, just 12 people ultimately consulted with the Kaiser and helped to make this decision for war. 12 people were contributed to a decision to go to war. Naturally, this is my interpretation. It is not the only interpretation, but it is one that I hope has provided plenty of food for thought for you, and one that I hope will provoke some interesting questions, which I am now fully prepared to address for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Spencer. So just a reminder, you can submit a question using the question and answer icon. Okay, I'll let you take a sip, but now we've got a lot of questions coming. So our first question is from Rita, and she asks, was there a significant German-speaking population in the Alsace-Lorraine long before the Franco-Prussian War? And how were they treated by the French?
That's a really interesting question. it depends how you define significant. There certainly was a German population in Alsace-Lorraine, and in fact, the Alsatian accent is actually slightly odd. It sounded slightly odd to Parisian French. It had got slight German and indeed Dutch inflections. So there was a German population there, and they were largely treated as French citizens, but they did not have voting rights. They did not have the suffrage when they were living in Alsace-Lorraine, unless they naturalized as French citizens. But there's very little suggestion that there was any sort of problem there. In fact, there was a certain amount of cross-border trade, movement, traffic. There were French people who worked in Germany, and indeed Germans who worked in Alsace-Lorraine. So the situation there was actually quite mild. Of course, it changed quite dramatically after the German occupation. The French population there was not treated especially well. Was subject to German laws, subject to learning the German language, and so on and so forth. So before the annexation, the neighbours got along quite well, but afterwards there was certainly tension there.
Thank you. So the next question is from Jack, and Jack asks, can you please discuss how the lessons learned from the rapid mobilization of the German army in 1870 affected the inevitability of World War I, given a decision to mobilize any combatant's army?
Well, that's a really good question, and the best way I can describe this is actually to draw a parallel between the Cold War and that tremendous fear about being hit by a first strike in nuclear weapons. In 1870, the Germans were seen absolutely correctly to have mobilized far more efficiently than the French, to have concentrated their army much better using the railroads of the day, and to have that advantage it had gained by a fast mobilization, a well-organized mobilization, and a swift invasion of France had left the French in a position they could never militarily recover from, and had contributed directly to this enormous upsetting of the European balance of power, the crushing of the French army. And so from that point onwards, all nations became obsessed with their mobilization period and the speed with which they could do it, the efficiency with which they could do it, how quickly they could concentrate armies on their borders, either for offensive or defensive work, because it was felt if you were slow to mobilize, as the French had been in 1870, or mobilization was incompetent, you were at an enormous disadvantage, and one that you wouldn't be able to recover from. And so mobilization, much more so than say in the Second World War or indeed afterwards, was considered a real all or nothing situation in 1914. And that's why the Russian mobilization is seen by the Germans as so dangerous, and is seen as a suitable provocation for war, because it's felt that if Germany doesn't respond in kind to the Russian mobilization, well, hey, we might be attacked in the east, and suddenly it could be a reversal of 1870. It might be our unprepared army being overwhelmed by the Russians. And so mobilization becomes absolutely an obsession for European armies, perhaps not incorrectly given the lessons of 1870, but again, just like the tensions in the Cold War and this fear about if you're going to strike, you must strike first, it's exactly the same in 1914, except with conventional armies. The nation that strikes first is felt to be the nation that will win.
Okay, this next question is from George, and I think a lot of people have echoed the sentiment here. George asks, well, he says, I understand that Germany had a well-developed plans to attack France and Russia, and a desire to do so, but what really was the objective in doing so? Did Germany intend to annex more territory?
Well, again, this is a really interesting question, and the answer that we have is that Germany wanted, as far as we can tell, Germany had plans to completely reorder Europe and, by extension, the world. And we know this from a memorandum was produced in September 1914, whilst the war was in progress, the so-called September Memorandum by German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg. And this September Memorandum is a complete rewriting of European borders. It envisages the complete extinguishing of Belgian independence, the loss of the French northern coast, that's the coast that runs along the English Channel, the complete loss of central African colonies of both France and Belgium, so that's the Congo and so forth, which would allow Germany to have an African colonial empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. And the resettlement, in fact, of the Low Countries, so that is Belgium and Holland, with German soldier settlers who would ensure that these countries then became part of the German Empire. The German policy is a complete redressing of world boundaries. It would create an enormous empire in Africa, which they called Middle Africa, and effectively turn France into a rump state, a state without any independence, with huge territorial losses, extinguish the Low Countries, and leave Britain utterly isolated. So the long-term objective of this is conquest, a complete destruction of the European balance of power so that it cannot return ever again, and will leave Germany absolutely the dominant power in Europe.
Where did the naval race fit into this?
Well, the naval race was a strange policy from the Germans, and it's one that's baffled historians for years since. So Germany itself had no real naval traditions. It only has one seaboard of the Baltic Sea. And although it always had a great military tradition, an army tradition, the decision to try and invest in the navy may have been driven by industrial concerns that it would lead to a lot of jobs, especially on the Baltic coast. And also it was tied up with the idea of the race for Africa and indeed the race for empires that was ongoing in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. It's only possible for a European power to expand abroad if it has a certain amount of sea power that can transport it there. Germany needed that sea power to join the race for imperial holdings around the world. And of course, by the late 1890s, there was relatively little left of the world to seize. It had already been divided up between the great imperial powers. But that didn't discourage Germany. And indeed, the Kaiser called for what he said was a place in the sun for the Germans, the belief that they couldn't be constrained within their own borders. They need to expand into the world. So a navy was a requirement for that. But of course, by building a large, powerful fighting navy, it was almost a gun aimed at the heart of Great Britain, which was the only true great naval power in Europe by early 1900. And this enormous naval building program was always going to threaten Britain and provoke a response. One of the side attitudes that the Germans had was it was felt that it would act as a deterrent weapon, that it would keep Britain out of European affairs because British government would be so worried about what damage could the German Navy do. Perhaps it could land an army in Britain, or perhaps it could destroy the British fleet, or so on and so forth. But in reality, that was never the case. The British always maintained a naval lead over the Germans. And in fact, the strategic point of the naval race was quickly lost for the Germans. They couldn't outstrip the British in building, and it wasn't a deterrent weapon either. All it did was it antagonized the British and actually pushed them closer to the French and the Russians. It was a strategic disaster, and indeed the sad fate of the German fleet was ultimately to mutiny at the very end of the First World War, and rebellious sailors carrying communist flags and Bolshevik flags actually marched on Berlin to overthrow the Kaiser in November 1918. And I think there's no greater example of the folly of the German fleet than the fact that that was its ultimate fate, that its greatest champion, the Kaiser, was ultimately overthrown by Bolshevik sailors from that same fleet.
Wow. So moving south, and I think this might be a little more specific question. Why was Ferdinand in Serbia to begin with?
Well, that is a good question. Ferdinand was a bit of a law unto himself. He'd married for love. His wife Sophie did not come from a suitable social class, according to the Austro-Hungarian royal family, but he loved her, and so he'd married her, even though as part of that marriage, he'd had to renounce his right to the throne. And Franz Ferdinand was quite a difficult man. Although we might admire his willingness to sacrifice his power for love, in all other respects, he was a bit of a law unto himself. He traveled where he wanted. He often put himself in rather risky positions. And his decision to travel south to Sarajevo as part of a tour was provocative. It was quite deliberately provocative for the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, although he couldn't legally take it, to show himself here. Security for this tour was completely inadequate, ill-prepared. There was a certain arrogance about this, which was completely unfounded given the risks to members of the royal family. But he essentially did it because he wanted to. And it was almost, he did a number of these rather risky tours, suddenly appearing in countries where he perhaps wasn't necessarily expected to appear. And I like to think, although we don't really know, but I like to think this was almost just him expressing his independence. He was certainly an independently minded man, despite being a very difficult one. And he had no real reason to be there. It was a chance to sort of show Austro-Hungarian prestige, but there was no great purpose to being there. And indeed, if he hadn't gone there, perhaps the world would be a very different place.
So I think this will be our last question, Spencer, but I want to thank you, and thanks to the nearly 700 people that tuned in today. So Italy, where was Italy involved in all of this? What side were they on, and did they shift sides at any point?
Well, Italy is a peculiar case, and they're almost a law unto themselves. Italy, relatively new nation, only become completely united in the 1870s. They were allied to Germany and Austro-Hungary, which was peculiar because they couldn't Germany and Austro-Hungary couldn't really give Italy anything it really wanted. And Italy and Austro-Hungary actually had a very, very long and bitter relationship. Austria had ruled Italy for centuries, certainly for years, and had caused a number of problems. So Italy was linked into this alliance, but didn't really want to be in it. Italy wanted to expand, and the two directions it could expand were either into North Africa, or it could actually expand into the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it couldn't really expand into the lands of its allies, so it had had various adventures in Africa, many of which had gone absolutely disastrously wrong. It was, as Bismarck said, it was a country with a great appetite but very poor teeth. When war came in 1914, it was linked to Austro-Hungary and Germany as part of the Triple Alliance. And the Germans actually expected an Italian army to appear in Germany and help them in their invasion of France, or at least help hold the border. The Italians thought about doing this, they really did, but they had a huge wobble as the crisis mounted. And the wobble was caused by two things. The first was, it was pointed out to the Italian government that the vast majority of the coal that Italy relied upon for its industries and so on was imported from Britain. And so if Italy was to declare war on Britain and its allies, then all that coal would be cut off and it would create an economic crisis. The other problem was that Italy didn't really see any advantage from getting involved. It didn't really want anything from France. It certainly didn't want anything from Serbia and Russia. What it really wanted was Austro-Hungarian territory, but of course that was its ally. And so at the 11th hour, Italy leaned on what was not incorrectly the treaty regulations. The Triple Alliance was a defensive treaty. It was designed to activate the powers if they were attacked. And as Italy pointed out, Germany was invading France, Austro-Hungary was invading Serbia. This was not a defensive war. And so it actually sat out the first few months of the war. Then both sides fought over it diplomatically about what side would it join. And then in May 1915, it was finally persuaded by the Allies to join the Allied cause, and it would fight alongside the Allies for the remainder of the war.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. But again, I want to thank everyone for joining today. And if you've enjoyed this presentation, please consider making a donation to Rhodes Scholar at rhodesscholar.org/give. So thank you very much. And Spencer, I'll see you soon.
Thank you very much.